As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
The people asked, and I'm so glad that Yara obliged to be back on the Malcolm Effect. You killed that last episode. Everyone was talking about it. You got me in a bit of trouble, but we're not going to go into that. Welcome back, Yara. Thank you so much. You've become a friend of the podcast. So how are you? How are you?
I'm good. Oh no, I got you in trouble. We'll have to talk about that after. I'll need to hear about that. But I'm doing good. Thanks for bringing me back on.
No, thanks for coming on. As always, your tweets. Funnily enough, I had a friend. I don't want to gas you up too much, but I just need to say this point. I had a friend yesterday call me from London and was like, "Who is that Yara woman that you're sharing?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I met on Clubhouse and she come on the podcast." Go, "Listen, her tweets are always on point." I'm like, "Yeah, come on, I only roll with G's. I only roll with OGs. Like, come on."
Oh my goodness,
Nah.
thank you. I mean, I had a funny transition into Twitter via Clubhouse, which is sort of weird. People are like, "What do you mean you just got on Twitter because you started using Clubhouse?" But a friend from Clubhouse made me get a Twitter account, and of course I've now become addicted to that too. So when we first chatted, I was addicted to Clubhouse. Now I'm addicted to Twitter. So you can imagine I'm not being very productive in my life.
Well, I hope this today serves as an intervention from your addiction.
Thank you. Yes, I think it will. I think putting all those tweets to use to do something, I think, valuable.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you. I mean, depending who you talk to, it's quite a serious topic, and I think there's so many ways we can approach this. And this is the question of Palestine. And depending on who you speak to, you're going to get a plethora of voices and comments and viewpoints. And as someone, I'll be honest, this podcast is me doing my learning in public, and I'm as someone I trust takes, I'm just going to throw it at you and ask you questions, and which I think people need to understand and be aware of when it comes to Palestine. So maybe we can maybe start off with, this can be as long as you want, as brief as you want. Do you want to detail the conflict or the issue of Palestine for us?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a big question to start. I think the best way to understand the situation in Palestine is through a framework of settler colonialism. And I guess what I'll do is I'll make a distinction, right? So I think that there are idealist analyses of Palestine, and then there are materialist analyses, right? And we largely see the idealist analyses in the mainstream media manifest in a couple of ways, right? So we get frameworks that say, oh, there are two different kinds of people who are fighting over the land, and they disagree ideologically. Sometimes the position will be, oh, they disagree via religion, right? And in that, there's a positioning of it's Jews versus Muslims, and that analysis argues that it's an age-old conflict and it's a religious conflict, right? That's an idealist framework. Another idealist framework can sometimes be the juxtaposition of modernity versus the Oriental, right? Or modernity versus backwardness, right? With Israel being seen as kind of like a modern sort of nation in the heart of a backwards or Oriental Middle East. And then, the last one that we see really often in terms of an idealist analysis is the juxtaposition of Western democracy versus authoritarianism, right? So Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, and authoritarianism usually being invoked to discuss Gaza, but sometimes we also see it being invoked around the West Bank, where, of course, there have been no elections for over a decade because of the occupying Zionist force. And so ultimately, the idealist analysis takes us to a place of Palestinians and Israelis are not able to get along, they're in conflict, and they need to be brought to a table to engage in dialogue and discussion and come to an agreement. But a material analysis would lead us to understand the specific formation of Zionism in the 19th century as a colonial ideology, which aligned itself with imperialism to achieve its colonial goals, right? And in the early 20th century, Palestine was colonized by the British. So Palestine was under a British mandate. And through the Zionist kind of appeals to the British, right, calling on the British to give them the land of Palestine, right? And we saw that through the Zionist movement. The
Yes.
British began to facilitate for Zionist settlers to come to Palestine. And the kind of the clear sort of pinpoint of that would be through the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which where essentially Palestine was, signed away, right, by Balfour.
Yes.
And oftentimes the historical analysis says, okay, there was the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and then in 1948 we had the Palestinian Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe,
Hmm.
whereby over 750,000 Palestinians were violently dispossessed out of Palestine, not including all of the Palestinians that were internally displaced. And of course, what gets lost in that kind of analysis of Balfour and Nakba is that between the period of 1917 to the period of 1948, Palestinians were actually organizing and resisting.
Okay.
And they were resisting, they were putting together different organizing cells across Palestine, and they were revolting and resisting against both British colonization and against Zionist settler colonialism, which as early as 1917 was beginning to mass dispossess Palestinian peasants and push them into really precarious labor forces or even leave them completely unemployed, and creating, as early as the 1920s, a particular wealth within the
Hmm.
Zionist settler communities. And so I think the settler colonial framework, which is the materialist analysis ultimately, is
Yeah.
the best way for us to understand Palestine. And through that kind of framework, we're able to kind of move throughout key points of Palestinian history, beginning at the Nakba, or even beginning pre-Nakba, and then all the way to today, and understand the situation in Palestine more clearly.
Thank you so much. And that was a beautiful kind of like overview. And I think, again, so many not red lights, so many flashlights are going off in my brain right now. First, that comes to mind. And I know these questions might seem very basic, but I think many of us on the left who are probably involved in reading theory, we can sometimes overestimate how aware people are sometimes. And the kind of premise of this podcast has always been that we strip it down to its bare, even if they give definitions so people understand. So what you said, two things to come to mind. You've said settler colonialism and you said Zionism. How
Mhm.
should we understand these terms?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with settler colonialism. And so, settler
Hmm.
colonialism is ultimately one of a few different kinds of colonialism. And with
Yeah.
settler colonialism, what you effectively have is it's a bit distinct from, say, like planter or it's like exploitative
Yeah.
colonialism, where the goal is just to have a couple of outposts, maybe corporations that are extracting resources and wealth and that are like heavily reliant on the local population for labor.
Hmm.
Settler colonialism is distinct because it effectively replaces the indigenous community with a new community. And so we
Hmm.
see, for example, Canada or what we understand as Canada and the United States and Australia as examples of settler colonies.
Yes.
And yeah, and in the case of settler colonialism, the primary goal is always possession, so
Of course.
removing the indigenous communities from the land. But then oftentimes the economic exploitation or proletarianization of those communities is part of that process as well. And so, for example, in the case of Palestine, we see economic processes of ultimately, and even political processes of apartheid being created in order to deal with the fact that settler colonialism is incomplete. And we can kind of unpack that a little bit more later.
Yep.
But in the case of, or to define Zionism, so Zionism is a political ideology that was
Yes.
really put together by Theodor Herzl in the 1800s. And effectively, what Herzl argues for is a Jewish homeland in Palestine, right? And interestingly, oftentimes we talk about Zionism and we fixate a lot on Jewish Zionism, which I understand why we do that, but it's
Yeah.
also important to bring into the conversation that there's also Christian Zionism, which in many ways
Mm.
actually predates Jewish Zionism, in that Christians have been advocating for, and it's actually extremely anti-Semitic, but they as part of A, anti-Semitism, and B, a particular reading of the book of Revelations in the
Hmm.
Bible, the Christian argument has been that Christian Zionism could be a way to force Jewish communities out of Europe. And now we see it also huge. Christian Zionism is huge in the United States with organizations like Christians United for Israel, CUFI, and others, which like key politicians, particularly from the Republican Party, are invested in or involved in. And Christian Zionism says this is a way for us to have Jewish people move away, like not be living in our communities. So there's the
Yeah.
key anti-Semitism there, but also it invokes the book of Revelations to argue that once Jewish communities then move to Palestine or Israel, then there will be the second coming, which is an extremely violent process for all Jewish communities who
Mm.
don't convert. So it's extremely anti-Semitic, a very scary ideology, and actually a lot of that ideology seeped into Herzl's work himself. But ultimately, what Theodor Herzl put together was and Herzl himself was very open about the fact that Zionism was a colonial project. He actually, I think, invoked the words, there is something colonial about Zionism, were the words that he used to advocate for and advocate to the British to grant the Zionist movement the right to settle in Palestine.
Okay. So when we think of like particularly forms of like Zionism today, I'm sure you're definitely aware, it's now has become equated to or falsely equivalated with, for example, equated with, sorry, when you say anti-Zionism, you have now adopted the position of anti-Semitism or to be anti-Jewish. How has that kind of come to being, or what trends have you seen that caused that to emerge? And then we've also seen the pushback against BDS as well.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. And I think it's important for us to first situate or understand that there have been extremely long traditions of Jewish anti Zionism, like visions for Jewish liberation that, like,
Hmm.
didn't necessarily identify as anti Zionism because they predate the formation of Herzl's vision of Zionism, but organizing around this concept that we will dismantle anti-Semitism, right? So we saw a lot of this
Okay.
organizing in Europe,
Yeah.
which was basically Jewish communities and that were coming together to organize around anti-Semitism, how to fight anti-Semitism, wanting to create or
Hmm.
having visions for a world where anti-Semitism does not exist, right? The
Yes.
material conditions of basis of anti-Semitism defeated. Zionism kind of becoming the fixation and sort of becoming equated to Judaism is also
Yes.
an erasure of that extremely long history of Jewish communities organizing for their liberation without using
Mm.
Zionism, right? And we see that like continuations of that tradition today through organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace or
Yes.
Independent Jewish Voices, right? These are anti-Zionist Jewish organizations who are really
Hmm.
challenging the way in which Zionism and anti-Semitism are conflated. You know, I'm
Hmm.
very mindful of the fact that I think it was just yesterday or the day before when students
So it
at
happened in London, yeah?
yes, yeah, yeah. And the way in which students at LSE effectively like blocked all of the entries and protested against this extremely racist, Nakba
Yeah.
denying ambassador.
I don't want to go off track, but again, I don't even know who she is, but I've seen so much of the fallout online. They're saying that even amongst like Zionists, they consider it to be quite extreme.
Yeah, she was, I think, the first representative for like settlements. Like I don't know the
Oh,
role of
wow.
her title. Yeah, so she was central to the Israeli settlement project. She denies that the Nakba ever happened.
Oh,
You know,
wow.
she is anti-interracial marriage, like all of these things. And so we see, right, how this person who ultimately stands against, like, I mean, if we understand that all of our liberation is intertwined, right? This is clearly someone who does not represent collective liberation, right?
Of
And
course.
this idea that protesting her and protesting her presence on a campus is anti-Semitic is really, I mean, I think an insult to how we
Yep.
understand and how severe anti-Semitism really is. And so this conflation, right, which is ultimately really happened both by Christian Zionists and by like the different elements of the Zionist lobby, it's just a way for Israel to shield itself from any kind of critique, right? So any critique of the Jewish state, the quote unquote Jewish state, right? Because Israel calls itself the Jewish state. It suggests like it speaks on behalf of world, like all of the Jewish communities in the world. But
Yeah.
when you really look at especially new statistics and things like that, like I know here in Canada, a poll was done pretty recently by CJPME and IJV and a couple of other organizations. And what they found was that large amounts of Jewish Canadians don't identify with the Israeli state. And those numbers are changing every year. More and more Jewish
Wow.
Canadians, Jewish Americans, Jewish folks in the UK are starting to feel like they don't connect with whatever the project is that's happening over there. And you
Mm-hmm.
see kind of this the Israeli state going into or using all kinds of tools to try to force that connection, right? We see that through Birthright, which is a program through which any Jewish person in the world can claim
Yep.
birthright and go on a trip to Palestine while Palestinians are denied the right to return.
Why did you do that? Now I'm gonna have the Israelites, the black people who think they're Jewish, gonna they're gonna claim their citizenship. Now I'm just playing.
cut that part out of the pot. No, I'm just kidding. But so Israel is consistently in a process of trying to manufacture a relationship between
Yep.
Jewish communities globally and the settler colonial project. And I think more and more we're seeing Jewish communities say, no, not in my name. That's not my project. I'm not going on birthright. I
Mhm.
refuse to do that. And we're seeing the growth of this anti-Zionist movement that is rejecting the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much. So another thing people ask then, because obviously someone is involved in organizing, activism, what okay, we have BDS obviously, but we also have other forms of like protests that take place outside embassies. What I know you don't speak on behalf of all activists, but what is the kind of what is the objective that people who are anti-Israel as a state, as a project, calling for? Are they calling for like it gets so sensationalized? Oh, they're calling for Israel to be wiped off, or they're calling for a second Holocaust, and all these things that which they say that they know that will stir emotions in the minds and hearts of people. But what is it? Is it a two-state solution? Is it a one-state solution? Is it for Israel to no longer exist? Like, what would you say is, or what are you calling for?
Yeah, I think that the way I understand this is not in state solutions, right? I think there's a fundamental flaw in sort of the fixation on state building, and
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes the way in which state building actually has been used by Israel, by the United States, right through the Oslo Accords and all of these different kind of things, to understand this project of, oh, well, we can just help the Palestinians build some kind of shell of a state, right, through particular state
Yeah.
institutions and so on. And so I think ultimately the best way to understand this movement is this is a movement for national liberation. This is a national liberation struggle, right?
Mm,
And that means that anybody who lives on the land, right, who is not there to subjugate Palestinians, right, who also believes in the freedom and liberation of Palestinians, could technically join this national liberation struggle. And we see some of this starting to happen, I think, with certain Israeli citizens who are refusing to serve, right? I think they're called refuseniks. So there's a small, I guess, really, really small at this point movement, people who live there, Israelis who are, and I think another example could be like Jeff Halper, who's written a book called something like Decolonizing Palestine or something along those
mm-hmm.
lines. There is this small movement of Israelis who are against colonization. But I think it's also important to note that there's a larger number, unfortunately, of Israelis who, at this point, their only issue is with the settlements, right? These are kind of
Mm-hmm.
what we call liberal Zionists, right? They believe in the project of Israel. They believe in the 67 borders, for example, and they're just really upset by the settlements. They're like, we want the settlements to stop. The issue is the occupation, but not colonization. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is also kind of like an obfuscation of the struggle because they end up taking up quite a bit of space. They end up directing conversations to be that the issue is the settlements. And through that, they oftentimes separate the settlers from the state, right? And I think when we
Mm,
challenge that separation and we understand that actually in a settler colony, the settlers are tasked with settling the state's frontier, right? So in Israel,
yes.
the settlers are protected by the Israeli occupation forces. They are given monetary compensation to settle outside of the bounds of the state, and they're
Wow.
integral to the state itself, right? And inside the 48, Palestine occupied in 48, there's also a role that settlers play. For example, within Israel proper, there's an organization called Garin Torani, which opens yeshivas in mixed cities. And mixed cities are like cities like Ajami, which is in Jaffa, or Ramle, or Lid. These are all cities within 48. Mixed
Mm-hmm.
cities are basically, these are cities that were once heavily populated with Palestinians, and the
Mm-hmm.
Israeli state launched campaigns to mix those cities by encouraging Israelis to move into the state, right? To essentially change the character of those cities. There's an internal process within Israel. People love to pretend like, oh, Israel's post-colonial. The issue is not within the framework of Israel. The issue is the settlements. But Israel itself is internally a colonial project with Palestinians who live in it also impacted by processes of colonization. And this organization, Garin Torani, essentially their goal is to buy significant amounts of property in Palestinian neighborhoods like Ajami, which they're able to buy through state processes of underdevelopment and gentrification and state apartheid laws. And they want to effectively make those cities more quote unquote Jewish, right? And so they
Mm-hmm.
see internally these cities as an internal frontier. So this idea that we can just behave like, okay, this is maybe there's a struggle here
Wow.
around one state versus two state, and liberal Zionists would argue that, oh, well, if Israel just stops its settlement building and stops its occupation, everything will be okay. We can have two states, is also false, right? I think we need to re-solidify ourselves that this is a struggle for Palestinian national liberation. We are fighting for the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. Anyone who wants
Mm-hmm.
to fight for this struggle with us is welcome to join us. Anyone who is not there in order to subjugate us is welcome to be part of our struggle. This is a struggle for national liberation.
Thank you so much. And I think when you situate it like that, it removes so much of the obfuscations we see online today. And I'm going to just say straight up, and I think I can, things like, oh, but but Palestine and Arabs are anti-black, which is, sorry, I get so pissed off when I hear that shit, if I'm honest with me, because I'm thinking, okay, but this is, as if you're Pan-Africanist, people who claim that, and again, that term has unfortunately been hijacked by so many cultural nationalists. But if you are Pan-Africanist in the sense how Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré defined it, the complete unification and liberation of Africa under scientific socialism, then you have the tools at your disposal to see what is happening here.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, yeah, of course, there's going to be issues of race. Cuba has issues of race. Which country doesn't have issues of race? But again, it's a very clear demarcation between colonizer and the colonized people. That's it. And that's the side you have to choose right now. Everything else is secondary or tertiary or even beyond that, actually, if I'm honest.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I don't like about it as well, I know I'm going on a rant and a tangent, but what I don't like about it as well, it also removes the internationalism of Black radicals historically. I mean, recently I think we were commemorating marking the death anniversary of Kwame Ture.
Mm-hmm.
And someone like Kwame Ture said that, there can be no Black liberation similarly without the liberation of Palestine. The Black Panthers had the same objective. How many of our Pan-African leaders saw, like, okay, the same forces of imperialism that cause the subjugation of people on the continent are the same forces at play and the same alliances being made that are oppressing the Palestinian people. So again, I just find, sorry, that was I don't know how I even got there, but I just thought of, I see some things online, particularly I'm going to name and shame the Afro-pessimists who speak about, and they have a particular problem with Palestinians and Palestine because of their nonsensical, anecdotal experiences when they went to Palestine or whatever. And somehow that has now been used to extrapolate and project that onto the whole cause. So for example, they say, okay, yeah, even if Palestine was to be liberated, we're going to have to deal with the anti-Black problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or your readings have led you anywhere around those topics.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that certainly there are, of course, issues within Palestinian society, right? This is an imperfect society. This is a society that is riddled with the realities of colonization, right? They are consistently put into a place where they are not able to deal with really a lot of the issues that we talk about here,
Mm-hmm.
primarily because they're consistently facing colonialism. But Yeah, but I think certainly once Palestine is liberated, we absolutely will have a lot of work to do, right? But I think what you mentioned about like this long history of co-resistance and internationalism between black radicals and Palestinians is so important. And I love that you brought up Kwame Ture, because one of, I think, the greatest videos to ever be done on Zionism was by
For
Kwame
real.
Ture, right? He's got this hour
For
and
real.
something long lecture. You can find it on YouTube. You can just type Kwame Ture and Zionism, and it comes up, and it's just incredible, right? And he talks about, he challenges the idea of Zionism as a self-determination movement. He ties Zionism to imperialism. Huey Newton has pieces on Palestine, on why the Panthers took a position of supporting Palestine.
Hmm.
And Huey Newton even visited Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon.
Hmm.
And so there were connections that these folks were actually making, because what they were doing was they weren't just saying, we care about Palestine because Palestinians deserve to be cared about. What they were saying was Israel's role in the world is a role of an agent of empire. This is a settler
Hmm.
colony that works hand in hand with the American empire that is oppressing Black people in the
Yeah.
United States, right? And we see that today. We see how the skunk water that's used in Palestine is then used on
Yep.
protesters in the United States. We see
Yep.
how the weapons that Israel tests on Palestinians and the surveillance that Israel uses to test on Palestinians is then exported to all parts of the world, to Colombia, right? Israel plays a really reactionary role in the repression of people in Colombia. Israel has a strong relationship with India's fascist Modi government, and so on and so forth. So Israel has a central role in world
Exactly.
imperialism. And what people like Kwame Ture and Huey Newton and Angela Davis to this day consistently talks about these things, talking about when they talk about the liberation of Palestinians, when they talk about Israel's role, they're making connections between all of our oppression, because
Yep.
our oppressors are also making these connections, and we understand then, to use Hassan Kanafani's words, right? He says, "Oh, and I'm going to misquote him, and I hate misquoting Kanafani, but he says, imperialism has laid its body over the world, and wherever you hit it or wherever you strike it, you serve the world revolution, right?" And we know that this was
Mm,
kind of the internationalism of people like Kanafani and people like Huey Newton and Kwame Ture, right?
yep.
And yeah, I think that this long history, I'll share, one of my favorite stories of solidarity between the Palestinian struggle and the Black struggle. Actually, there's a few, right? I mean, we know, for example, that when Angela Davis was in prison, prisoners from Palestine sent her a letter. They smuggled a letter out of their prison cell, and it made its way into her prison cell. And it was this like letter of
Wow.
solidarity. But then we also know that like Sami al-Qasim, who wrote this beautiful poem called Enemy of the Sun, and he wrote it
No.
while he was a prisoner. He's a Palestinian political prisoner. And
Hmm.
this poem would make its way, right? George Jackson actually wrote this poem in his
Oh.
in his notebook while he was in prison. And it was when the notebook was seized and reproduced, right? Like put up for people to see that these were George Jackson's writing. They saw this poem and they assumed that George Jackson had written it, right? And I'm forgetting who it was, but someone who was previously involved with the Panthers called this like mistake of radical kinship, right? Because like the sentiments of Sami al-Qasim inside prison spoke so much to George Jackson that we almost couldn't tell who wrote the poem, right? So it's just like, there's this
Wow.
long history of internationalism and co-resistance, and I think that through understanding Israel's role in relation to empire, which Kwame Ture is really has done this brilliant job at
Yep.
doing, we're able to understand this very clearly.
No, absolutely. And I think something that the progression of, let's say, into and the subsumption of neoliberalism of our politics and having the radicalism, particularly the internationalism, removed from our figures, we forget the likes of William Patterson, 51, we charge genocide.
Hmm.
Or then when Malcolm, one of Malcolm's last attempts before he was assassinated was to bring a petition to the UN. And in doing so, it was a recognition of the status of Black people, African Americans, as a subcolony. within,
Mm-hmm.
or as colonized people within
Yes.
America, and it was making those links that allowed that further on, inspired the internationalism that we see in the likes of, let's say, in the Panthers, for example, who
Mm-hmm.
many use Malcolm as their go-to. And I feel like, so again, I feel like if and what's coming to mind right now, and I know you're going to speak about it, is where does Fanon fit in all of this?
I love that you knew that. I mean, I can't really ever have a conversation about this or anything really without bringing up Fanon. So yeah, I mean, I think Fanon's work, like particularly, when Fanon says that his project is a project of stretching Marx, right? He
Yeah.
seeks to stretch Marx because in the colony, he says the substructure is also the superstructure. And one of the
Yes.
reasons that I find myself so incredibly steeped in Fanon's analysis of the colony is, I think, reading through, in particular, Hassan Kanafani's work on the 1936 to 1939 revolts in Palestine, which is, by the way, like in my opinion, one of the most critical reads for anyone trying to learn more about Palestine. And so, what Kanafani maps out is actually the ways in which the Palestine Communist Party, pre-Nakba Palestine, so this was the Palestine Communist Party of like the 1910s and 1920s, which was ultimately a Zionist party, right? It was connected to the USSR, but it did not
Mm-hmm.
necessitate an anti-Zionist position until it was far too late,
Mm.
right? And one of the things Kanafani maps out is he highlights this incident on May 1st, 1920, where there's a clash between the Zionists and the communists. And the executive committee of the party essentially puts out a statement which basically says, look, we are here, Jewish workers are here to live with you. Like, this is a statement to the Palestinian workers. They're saying the
Mm-hmm.
Jewish workers are here to live with you. We will fight, we want to fight side by side with you against the capitalist enemy, be the enemy Jewish, Arab, or British, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
call on Palestinians to fight against the rich who are selling their land, their country to
Mm-hmm.
foreigners. And they say, down with British and French bayonets, down with the Arab and foreign capitalists, right? And
Mm-hmm.
Kanafani pinpoints in his analysis that the most essential thing to take from this statement is that the word Zionism was missing entirely from it. And so this
Mm.
effectively, some type of Zionist/Zionist sympathetic, like there were Zionists in its ranks, Communist Party was basically towing this line of Jewish and Palestinian workers unite against this capitalist enemy, right? And for
No.
Palestinians, they were actually effectively being, during this time frame, heavily dispossessed, removed from their lands, and having Zionists replace them on their land. So how could you engage them
Wow.
in an anti-colonial struggle and ignore the word Zionism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because for a lot of people, they could read this actually as this is the case of class reductionism. But
Yeah.
actually, I think through Fanon's work, we can see that what it represents is a fundamental misunderstanding of class, right? And so in the colony,
Mm.
Fanon teaches us that class formation is related to colonial status, right? And we see how
Yeah.
this continues today, despite certain Palestinians being allowed to ascend into roles of the petty bourgeoisie. And
Mm-hmm.
this actually makes me think, of this. I'm going to cite your podcast, but this thing makes me think of the episode that where you and Deej had Dr. Joy James on.
Yeah.
And there was this brilliant quote that she said that I literally just replayed it over and over and I wrote it down, where Dr. Joy James says, if the state has longevity, it knows to have proxy soldiers, right? And that
Mm.
quote stuck with me so much because I think even though the Israeli settler colonial state has sort of shifted to understand that it needs to allow for certain segments of the Palestinian bourgeoisie to or petty bourgeoisie to ascend, right? And we see that both in the West Bank with the simultaneous comprador and the petty bourgeoisie, and inside the
Yep.
lands of 1948 with also the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, the underpinning of the state is still dependent on colonial status, right? And that's something that
Yep.
we can only clearly understand through the framework that Fanon offers us.
Exactly, and that ties in brilliantly to Kwame Nkrumah. But honestly, if you're going to think about his understanding or how he details the role of the comprador the role comprador class, or the role of the petty bourgeoisie and the creation of these petty bourgeoisie, is what is to ensure that finance, capital, and imperialism is continued.
Mm-hmm.
So same thing. One happens internally, one happens externally, but their role is the same.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important. Yeah, it's important to situate it around that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh, this has been that's been dope. Sorry, this has been
No,
that's been really really
actually,
dope.
let me also add a little bit more of like the class
Please.
analysis to that, right? And so let's take it back again to 1901.
Hmm.
Israel Zangwill, who was a British Zionist and one of the founders of the Jewish Territorial Organization and a friend of Theodore Herzl's, went to the Article Club in the UK,
Yeah.
and he made an appeal to British capitalists, which was, you can find it on record. It's called The Commercial Future of Palestine. And in this
Okay.
appeal, he says, look, the Palestinian state has slept for centuries and is greatly hindered by, it doesn't have roads, railways, harbors, water power. He says that the land has just a small population of Arabs and fallahin, farmers,
Yeah.
and he says wandering, lawless, blackmailing Bedouin tribes. He mocks the Palestinian economy, right? He says that they've got all this fertile land and unused minerals, and the Palestinians have failed to exploit and develop it. And he kind of has this statement where he says, the sleep must end. The great powers are awake. Not only Russia and Germany, but the great powers of steam and electricity, right? And he
Hmm.
argues that the solution to wake Palestine from its slumber is the creation of a Jewish nation state. And he says Zionism will regenerate the land, create industries and railways, and in the long run, it will pay for themselves. And he says, and this is one of the where that famous quote comes from. He says, "Restore the country without a people to the people without a country." Right. So
Hmm.
it's effectively he invokes and he says that they will make the wilderness blossom as the rose, right? Kind of this
Okay.
undertowing of they will make the desert bloom. And effectively, what he's saying, right, when he invokes all of this, is he's saying not that the space is empty. He understands that there are people there, right? And we
Yes.
see this also with settler colonial projects on Turtle Island and so on, right? This imagination of the land as empty, as a place to be developed by the capitalists and colonists. It's not that they think that the land is actually empty, but they see the land as, because the indigenous populations are not properly extracting, like to them they're not productive enough, there isn't enough extraction coming from the land,
Wow.
therefore it is not rightfully theirs. And this kind of ties back to like liberal capitalist frameworks, like from John Locke, right, who also makes these
Hmm.
kinds of claims, right? And so effectively what they were appealing to was a colonial, they were appealing to an imperialist, the British, to create this mass amounts of profits, right?
Hmm.
And we see that kind of class relation. We see the very realities of that through dispossession, proletarianization, and actually something that's largely unknown, which are labor camps. And so, I've already kind of mentioned that through Zionist colonization of Palestine, Palestinians would be dispossessed from the land and pushed into the workforce, right? And so we
Hmm.
see this kind of Fanon's assessment of class in the colony, where
Yes.
Fanon says you are rich because you are white because you are poor, right? And so
Yeah.
we see that in Palestine, where Palestinians are immediately dispossessed from the land and subjugated, and
Wow.
Zionists are able to own the land that Palestinians lived on. And so we see that racialized class formation.
Hmm.
And we also see that while the primary goal was the complete dispossession, it came with economic subjugation because the project of settler colonialism is incomplete, right? So apartheid
Hmm.
exists because settler colonialism is not complete. Yeah. And
Mm.
so
Wow.
a really like a something that's a
Wow.
less kind of known historical crime is that between 1948 and 1955, thousands of Palestinians were actually placed into at least 22 Zionist run labor camps. And this is something that's been researched and revealed through the work of Palestinian historian Salman Abu Sitta. And
Hmm.
he's able to reveal how Israel captured and imprisoned particularly able-bodied Palestinian men, stole them from their families to work in camps, and that these camps were these forced laborers supported Israel's wartime economy. So this was between 48 and 55. And so we see how economic subjugation went hand in hand with dispossession because Israel's settler colonial project was incomplete. And this kind of relation, this class relation, continues to exist today, where Palestinians continue to be the basis of the Palestinian labor and resources continue to
Wow.
be the basis of Israeli economy, right? So of course we see that through land and resource theft, right? The building of settlements, the stealing of water, stealing of resources, and things that we've already mentioned, for example, testing weapons and surveillance on
Yep.
Palestinians and marketing them to the world, but also through labor theft. I mean, thousands, tens of thousands of Palestinians cross through checkpoints every single day to Israel to work for Israeli companies in almost entirely
Wow.
what would be deemed as quote unquote unskilled labor. And I put those quotes because we know that that all labor is
Yeah,
skilled,
of
right?
course. Of
And that
course, yeah.
unskilled labor is just code for underpaid and overexploited. And so these Palestinians have to use daily work permits and spend hours at checkpoints, in particular Kalandia checkpoint, in order to enter Israel to work for extremely low wages. And so effectively, Palestinians in the West Bank provide Israel with, to use Marx's words, a reserve army of labor. And that's by design, right? And so even though the Israeli settler colonial project likes to pretend like, oh, Israel is this post-colonial society, right? I mean, liberal Zionists like to pretend that at least,
Yeah.
right? The basis of the Israeli economy continues to this day to be what Fanon outlined, which is colonial relations.
And once again, if you're not using a material analysis this late in the day, we have no use for it. No, I'm just joking. But thank you so much. I mean, we could actually go and speak about so much, but I'm just wary of the time. Anything you want to add to that, or
Maybe the one thing that I will add, just to like close us off on something a
yeah,
little bit more positive, right?
yes,
Is so through this materialist analysis, we understand Israel existence, right, and their settler colonial model is also by nature imperialist, right? And I mean,
yeah,
Nick Estes in particular has lots of work, I think, important work that ties colonization and imperialism and understands them not as like distinct processes, but in relationship to one another. And
mm-hmm.
so Israel's role globally and in the Middle East is essentially expansionist, right? Israel not
Okay,
only expands into the West Bank and consistently encroaches on the West Bank through settlements, but Israel currently occupies the Golan Heights in Syria. And Israel
mm,
used to occupy South Lebanon, right? Actually, it had a brutal occupation of South Lebanon, which my Lebanese side is from the South, was
yeah,
extremely impacted by. We couldn't go to Lebanon. My mother and grandmother couldn't go to my great grandmother's funeral because they would have had to get permits to cross into South Lebanon because there were checkpoints, right? I mean, so there was an Israeli occupation of the South.
mm-hmm.
And Israel also was involved in the Lebanese civil war, right? They worked with the Lebanese phalangists, the Lebanese fascists, to kill so many Palestinians, including we know of the massacres of Sabra and Shatila. We know Israel was involved in those massacres. Modern day Israel is consistently warmongering towards Iran, right? You can see that Israel is consistently trying to
Yep,
gear the United States to be hostile and invade Iran. We see like things like Joe Biden previously said, look, if there wasn't an Israel, we would have needed to create one, right? And imperialists are consistently talking about Israel as their biggest ally in the region. And that's not because of some kind of vague identifier of shared values. It's a material relationship. And then I've already
mm,
kind of alluded to Israel's role globally, right? I mentioned
yeah,
Colombia and India, right? And so I think what's really important then is that how do we resist this? We resist this through a framework of internationalism, right? There has been, as we already mentioned, decades long internationalism between Palestinian and Black revolutionaries. There was
yep,
internationalism between Palestinians and South Africa, internationalism between Palestinians and the Irish struggle, Cuba Palestine solidarity. And so I think the key thing that we can learn from this materialist analysis is that we cannot treat the case of settler colonization in Israel as sort of this regional or uniquely just Palestine problem, but rather we have
mm-hmm.
to understand it in relationship to all anti colonial and anti imperialist struggles globally.
And that's how you situate a struggle. Thank you. Nah, thank you so much for that, Yara. Once again, that's dope. Again, people, we're going to have Yara on again. Believe me. And we're going to do much more because I think you're a gem. And thank you so much for coming on the Malcolm Effect. You're listening to the Malcolm Effect with Momodu. Until next time, please like, comment, subscribe, either on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And until next time, peace out.